last week, Jeremy Taylor agreed to step down as the vice chairman of the Woodbury County Board of Supervisors. That was a position he was elected to last January.
But he vowed to remain on the board itself for the rest of his term, which expires next year. KTV's Katie Koppel was at tonight's meeting and joins us live in studio with more on Taylor's status on the board. Katie.
Matt and Jessica, Jeremy Taylor's resignation as vice chairman of the Woodbury County Board of Supervisors comes just 2 weeks after a federal jury convicted his wife, Kim Taylor, of 52 counts of election-related fraud. Several Woodbury County residents were at tonight's meeting. CWA Local 7177, the union representing the sheriff's deputies and correctional officers, provided a statement to the board tonight asking for the resignation or removal of Jeremy Taylor. In their statement, the union said if Taylor remains a part of the Board of Supervisors, they asked that he refrain from discussions or votes related to the sheriff's office or the new Woodbury County Jail. Also addressing the board tonight was the Western Iowa Labor Federation, which also asked for Taylor's resignation. Following his removal as vice chairman of the board, Jeremy Taylor addressed board members and the community.
Elected by the people of this county to do a job, and I take that very seriously and work hard to do the absolute best job I can. They hold us accountable every 4 years. I'm appreciative tonight about weighing in on what the right thing is for any other elected official, and I'm appreciative of the process that it's in the hands of the people, as it always should be.
Board Chairman Matthew Ung said while several members of the board have made their stance public on whether Taylor should remain on the board, they do not have the ability to remove him from elected office. That remains in the hands of the citizens of Woodbury County, the Iowa Attorney General, or the county attorney.
The Board of Supervisors has made very public comment, 3 of us have, about Mr. Taylor and what we think that he should resign. If the public wishes to comment, wishes to contact the AG's office, the county attorney, or district court through the process in Chapter 66, I would call on them to do that because this is, a time for everyone to use their own voice and realize that the board has done what it thought was right in the situation.
Now, Taylor does remain a member of the Woodbury County Board of Supervisors tonight. The U.S. Department of Justice has named Jeremy Taylor a, quote, unindicted co-conspirator in his wife's case, but he has not been charged with a crime. Nelson will remain vice chair of the board for the remainder of the year, which is through 2 scheduled supervisor meetings. Now, during the first meeting of the new year, the board will appoint a new chair and vice chair per regulation for the Board of Supervisors. Jeremy Taylor will remain on the board through the end of his term in 2024 unless otherwise removed. Matt and Jessica.
All right, Katie.